Okay, greetings everybody. I have a special guest on. We're going to be speaking about the topic of evolution, or rather, the orthodoxy of evolutionary theory. My name is Garin Kalustian, and allow me to introduce Dr. Casey Luskin. He is a geologist and a lawyer who works as Associate Director of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute. And as a lawyer, he's been practicing in the area of evolution education in public schools, and he's been a staunch defender for freedom for scientists who face discrimination and censorship because of their support for intelligent design. Casey, would you want to add anything else?
No, it's great to meet you, Garin, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Um, so to open up this conversation, first of all, I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm someone who has written about the topic of evolution a little bit before. And I personally come from a perspective where I was brought up believing in evolution wholeheartedly, in the evolution, the way it was presented to me wholeheartedly. Uh, it was a core part of my formal education growing up. I think, as like a 2000s baby, um, it's ingrained in my generation, is within the education curriculum, that this is how things came to be. And I think it's interesting because um, it's unlike other like past prior generations who may have come from a more religious background um, into their adulthood. They sort of came to understand evolution more and sort of left their religious background. And you hear all the time that people regard the Bible as like a book of fairy tales. And I say that because it's like in stark contrast to like where I am now, because I'm someone who sort of was brought up on the evolutionary orthodoxy. And now growing up, I've sort of come to scrutinize the what I think are the logical inconsistencies of evolution more closely. And now I sort of see evolution as sort of like it's got its own fairy tales. Um, so I would say, and the reason for that is quite simple. I think that I don't mean to ramble on. I just want to sort of just give you some
No, I'm
context.
loving it. Keep going. It's great.
The reason for that is because I think that evolutionary theory is a historian's issue. It's got an issue historically, meaning that from what it appears to me is that generally speaking, it makes sweeping generalizations about the historical account of the universe. Uh, it'll say that it'll have a point A and a point B. Point B being we are now the Homo sapien. Point A being we came from rocks or single celled organisms or apes or whatever. And then in between, there's just a bunch of gaps. There's a bunch of inferences made. And the problem I see with that is that it creates a mythology about those gaps. Anytime there's sort of like a discovery made about anatomy or genetics or biology or whatever it may be, there's always seems to be, a story created within the context of an evolutionary explanation. So, like, it'll be something like, oh, why don't humans have tails? Oh, it's because our caveman ancestors did X, Y, and Z, or something like that. Um, Now, before I let you just take the stage, I just wanted to um, just read an excerpt from this book that sort of I read a few years ago, and it gave me sort of the inspiration, or it made me aware of this sort of thinking about history. It's from the book On Theory and History by Ludwig von Mises, the libertarian economist. Um, I can pull it up here on screen real quick, just
I
so you can
definitely have
see
not
it.
read this book.
No, yeah, I recommend it. Give it a read. Let's see if it will. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'll just quick run through, and I'll just give my piece on it. Philosophies of history claim to avoid referring to individuality and irrationality. They pretend to provide a thoroughgoing interpretation of all historical events. What they really do is relegate the ultimate given to 2 points of their scheme, to its supposed beginning and its supposed end. They assume that there is at the start of history an unanalyzable and irreducible agency. For example, Geist is in the system of Hegel, or the material productive forces in that of Marx. And they further assume that this prime mover of history aims at a definite end, also unanalyzable and irreducible. For instance, the Prussian state of about 1825, or socialism. Whatever one may think about the various systems of philosophy of history, it is obvious that they do not eliminate reference to individuality and irrationality. They merely shift it to another point of their interpretation. Materialism wants to throw history overboard entirely. All ideas and actions should be explained as a necessary outcome of definite physiological processes, but this would not make it possible to reject any reference to irrationality. Like history, the natural sciences are ultimately faced with some data defying any further reduction to other data, that is, with something ultimately given. So, yeah, I bring that up. It's sort of in line with what I was already saying, that there's it's evolutionary theory. There seems to be a similar orthodoxy as similar to other ideologies that claim to have an explanation for history. That there's a point B and there's a point A and a point B, and there's like a prime mover, an invisible hand that's moving through it, and anything that occurs within this space of time between point A and point B is easily explained by the invisible hand. So yeah, take the stage. I don't know, whatever, however you want to pick apart what I just said.
No, I think that's a great excerpt you just read to sort of set the stage for talking about natural selection, Darwinian evolution, because yeah, they are treated as if they are these almost like magical processes that are endowed with unlimited power, and they can do whatever you want them to do. If you watch, there was this debate that was last year between Dr. James Tour and a YouTuber named Dave Farina. You may or may not have seen this, but it got a lot of attention online. But it was about the origin of life. And the idea is, well, how does the first cell arise? Well, all you need to start is a self-replicating molecule, and then natural selection and random mutation will take it the rest of the way. Almost like no details are required, because once you get that self-replicating molecule, natural selection is this all-powerful entity that can produce anything you wanted to produce. You don't have to really dig into the details, because we know it's like this magical power, this superhero that can do whatever we needed to do without us having to worry about it or really worry about it. So we don't have to ask too many questions about how it happened, because we know it can do it. And this is what you're up against when you're dealing with Darwinian evolution. I mean, I could give you example after example, not just the origin of life, but the origin of new genes is a great example. Where do new protein coding genes come from? Well, natural selection. Okay. You just have to duplicate some pre-existing gene, and then that gene duplicate just acquires mutations, and it randomly takes this random walk, and eventually it stumbles upon something functional. Then natural selection can take it the rest of the way. Random mutation, natural selection can do whatever you need. We don't need to ask the questions about the probability of taking a random sequence of DNA and spontaneously generating a totally functional gene, because we know that given enough trials, given enough opportunities, random mutation, natural selection, it will do that. And this last example, I'm referring to something called de novo gene origination. It's an idea that only, I think, a materialist evolutionist could come up with. But basically, it says that you have a random sequence of basically junk DNA that's not doing anything for you, and then wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, spontaneous random mutations spontaneously convert that random sequence into a fully functional protein coding gene. How does this happen? What is the likelihood of this happening? Nobody ever asked those questions. You just get these stories that are told. So it's very much in the mode of storytelling, the famous Just So stories and so forth that we've heard of. We get those a lot, but you don't have to worry about the details, because we know the mechanism is all powerful. Just don't look behind the curtain.
Now, going back to junk DNA, I want to understand what is the origination, the genesis of that term from an evolutionist perspective, because I've seen you write about it. I've seen you write about junk DNA, and how they're using it today. Uh, wasn't it used sort of to debunk like intelligent design? Is that sort of where it's coming from?
It has been used for that purpose for sure, Garn, but that was not necessarily the original use. Although the original use did come from very much a materialistic perspective, and I think wanting to sort of go down the road of what are the implications of my materialistic evolutionary view, and seeing how far they could take it. So the earliest example that I've seen of the term junk DNA being used was from a 1963 paper in a mainstream scientific journal. And this paper didn't really like go into a lot of detail, but it certainly speculated that a lot of our DNA would be junk. It uses the phrase junk DNA, said it would not be competent genetic material. And the idea at this point in the early 60s, they had just discovered sort of the mechanism that DNA encodes RNA, and then RNA is translated into proteins. So if you think of, I don't know if you know the whole pathway of producing proteins, but you have information in DNA, you have these 3 nucleotide codons, and every 3 nucleotides in the DNA is basically a little command that encodes an amino acid. Okay. And so you transcribe that DNA sequence into RNA. Then that RNA molecule basically carries a copy of the information in the DNA to another molecular machine called the ribosome. And that RNA, that's called a messenger RNA, it's thread through the ribosome, which interprets those 3 nucleotide commands or elements in the RNA, and then it uses that to string together a protein. Okay, so that's how your body. And then this is very sort of basic molecular biology.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that a lot of our DNA isn't doing that. It's not used for encoding proteins. It's just basically the result of millions of years of random mutations producing evolutionary debris that just starts to bloat up our genomes. There was the first time that I saw a paper, again, all coming from an evolutionary perspective, that really predicted how much of our DNA is junk, was a 1969 paper in the journal Science, which predicted that perhaps up to 99% of mammalian DNA is actually not true genetic material. And then the idea really got going in the early 70s with a Japanese evolutionary biologist named Susumu Ono. And he wrote this book chapter titled "So Much Junk DNA in Our Genome," and had a accompanying paper in the Journal of Human Evolution that basically said that at least 90% of mammalian DNA is essentially nonsense DNA. It's not doing anything. It's not there to actually help you to survive and reproduce. It's this junk DNA. And so from there, Susumu Ono was a very influential biologist. And from there, the idea really spread through the scientific community. In 1980, you had a pair of papers in the journal Nature that came out, one by J.4 Doolittle and Carmen Sapienza, both very influential biologists, that basically said that, natural selection will produce these DNAs that don't do anything. They're not actually helping you to survive. Their only function is to make copies of themselves. This is sort of following in the spirit of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, which you may have heard of that book. That came out in the late 70s. And again, the idea is that the purpose of a gene is to make copies of itself. Whether those copies happen to help you survive and reproduce along the way, great, but they may not. Their true fundamental purpose is just to make their own copies of themselves. And so another paper in that same issue of Nature was by Francis Crick, who of course was co-awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA, and then Leslie Orgel, who's a very eminent origin of life theorist. And their paper was titled "Selfish DNA, the Ultimate Parasite." So here we go. And they said that much DNA in higher organisms is little better than junk. And he went on to say that if that's true, then it would be folly in such cases to obsessively hunt for its function, because basically it's not doing anything for you. All it's doing is making copies. It's hitching a ride like a parasite on your genome to make copies
So
of
isn't
itself.
this okay, if I'm hearing you correctly, isn't this like contradicting the theory of evolution itself?
Well, in the sense that, what is the ultimate replicator? What is the ultimate survivor and reproducer of evolution? You might like to think it's you, or the organism. But Richard Dawkins would say, no, it's actually the gene.
Mm-hmm.
The gene is really the unit where evolution takes place. And that is where things either make it or they don't make it at the unit of the gene. So let me actually read you a quote from Dawkins. I think this is from his book, The Selfish Gene, but this is where he puts it very clearly. He says, "We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes." Okay. So your purpose, Garin, your purpose is to help your genes make copies of themselves. Okay. That is your ultimate purpose in life, according to Dawkins. I mean, a very, very lovely thought to end the workday on here. Um, and this, I think, but I think Dawkins, as always, is very eloquent at framing the issue. And he puts the evolutionary perspective, in very stark terms there. And that's so your purpose is to help your genes make copies of themselves. And if some of those genes in your genome, help you survive and reproduce, and others are parasites hitching a ride, so be it. So from there, we've taken this idea up to the 1980s, the early 80s. And what we can see is that this idea of junk DNA is coming entirely out of an evolutionary perspective, where the ultimate purpose is to survive and reproduce. Your genomes are the result of random mutations, millions of years of random mutations that might sometimes help you survive and reproduce, but other times they might not. I should have added, Susumu Ono was one of the founders of a sort of a model of evolution called the neutral theory, where not every mutation is actually affecting whether you survive and reproduce. A lot of mutations aren't doing anything to help you survive and reproduce. They aren't hurting you, they're not helping you. And so under that view, yes, junk DNA, useless DNA that's not doing anything, will bloat up your genome. So this very much flows right out of the mainstream evolutionary paradigm. So then we had ID coming around in probably the early 1990s, when ID first started to make waves in the scientific community. And it was at that time that you began to see junk DNA being used as an argument against intelligent design. Okay. And I could read you tons of quotes, but to that effect, but it was being used in that way. I can tell you my first sort of involvement with this debate was in the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was a student doing my undergraduate and master's at the University of California, San Diego. And I started a student club there called the Intelligent Design and Evolution Awareness, or IDEA Club, basically to help students have conversations about these topics. Most of my science classes, for better or for worse, I loved UCSD, but most of my science courses didn't give us an opportunity to discuss these topics. And so during club meetings, we would get hit over the head with junk DNA all the time. The club meetings were open to anybody. Didn't matter whether you were pro-ID, critical of ID, agnostic, not sure, whatever. Everybody was welcome. We tried to make everybody feel welcome. But us in the club who were supportive of intelligent design, and I certainly was coming from that view, we were always being told by our friends, hey, you cannot explain junk DNA. No intelligent agent would fill your genomes with random mutation and DNA that's not doing anything. And what I would say at that time is I would say, you know what? I actually think you're right. I think that if most of our genomes actually are functionalist junk DNA, then that probably is not very consistent with an intelligent design paradigm. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, at that time, this was like, again, the late 90s, early 2000s. They hadn't even finished the human genome yet, project at that yet, Garin. So we didn't even know the number of genes that were in the human body. And so at that point, what we would say is, look, I think it's premature for us to conclude definitively that this DNA is in fact junk DNA. Let's take a more cautious and careful, wait and see approach. And let's wait and see what the evidence actually says. And if it turns out that it is junk, fine. Then we'll modify. We'll be scientists and we'll reject this design view of the genome. But if it turns out that it is in fact functional, or at least it's not largely junk, but it's largely functional. There's a lot of huge spectrum of where we could land. But if it turns out that the genome is largely functional, then you know what? I think that ID will have made a very powerful prediction here. So anyway, that's in a nutshell the story. I don't want to dominate too much. So
no. I just want to interrupt that. So let me just get this straight in my own mind. So originally, junk DNA, its original usage was to describe basically the human organism or any organism as, reduce it to the gene level. and basically argued that 1% of genes were actually useful for reproductive purposes, and the rest were just doing their own thing. To the point of it, it makes me feel, yeah, like a parasite, basically, or even like a predator. It's eating yourself. Um, and then the conversation evolves to pitting junk DNA against, intelligent design. Um, but you're saying that the term junk DNA in itself is it was premature in the 90s. It was premature in the 70s. Um, so should we keep using that term junk DNA? Like, where have we gotten with that term today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that probably is the question that a lot of mainstream biologists have been asking over the last few years. So I talked about ID predicting that junk DNA would have function. And we were and I'll answer your question just a second here, whether we should use that term. Um, in the mid 90s and the late 90s, there were some early ID theorists who predicted that we would find function for the junk DNA. Forrest Mims is an ID-friendly engineer. William Dembski is an ID-friendly mathematician and philosopher, wrote some very foundational ID books. Richard Sternberg, a pro-ID biologist, wrote a couple of papers. Jonathan Wells, another pro-ID biologist, wrote a couple of papers predicting that we would find function for junk DNA. This is in the late 90s, early 2000s. This was really before, or right around the time that the Human Genome Project was completed. As you said, that study found that only 1% to 2% of our DNA encodes proteins. Doesn't mean that they were saying all the rest is junk, but certainly the view was that a very large proportion of the genome, and you get different percentages depending upon who you ask. Some people might say, we saw Susumu Ono over 90% of the genome. We find other people saying 80%, 50%, whatever, but very large percents of the genome were going to be junk. ID is predicting otherwise. So after the Human Genome Project, there were papers that began to trickle in, one by one, then 10 by 10, then more, discovering function for the junk DNA. And in 2011, Jonathan Wells, who's a biologist, one of my colleagues at Discovery Institute for many years, he actually just passed away a couple years ago. It was very sad. He's a great man. But Jonathan Wells published this book titled The Myth of Junk DNA. This was 2011. What he did was he just cataloged all these papers that had discovered function for junk DNA. And there were hundreds and hundreds of papers at that time. But in 2012, there was a groundbreaking series of papers that were published that I would say really kind of blew this debate open. And this was called the ENCODE Project. And it was basically a consortium of biologists all around the world who were studying this non-coding DNA, trying to figure out what it was doing. And when ENCODE published its major papers in 2012, what they basically found was that about 80% of the genome showed evidence of biochemical functionality. And this is basically evidence that it's being transcribed, being used in some way by the cell. And I have a colleague in the ID community who is a biologist at an Ivy League school, and this person studies RNA. And I asked them, in your field, what is the general vibe? If it's if the DNA is being transcribed into RNA, is that generally taken as evidence of function? And they said, yes, absolutely. If it's being transcribed in RNA, that usually for us means that there's probably some useful function going on there. They may have to go and then, study that specific genetic element to figure out exactly what that function is. But that is prima facie evidence of function when the DNA is being transcribed in RNA. And so somebody might say, okay, well, so ENCODE found that 80% of the genome is being used in some way. What about the other 20%? Does that mean that the rest of the genome is maybe potentially junk? And around the time these papers came out, there was a lead ENCODE researcher who said, look, when we did the ENCODE project, we only studied 147 cell types in the human body, okay? And it turns out that many of these non-coding DNA, when I say non-coding, I mean it doesn't code for a protein, okay? It could have a function, but its function is not to directly encode a protein. Many of these non-coding DNA elements, they're only functional in very specific cell types or in very specific stages of the human life cycle, okay? So to catch them in action could actually be very difficult. You have to catch them at just the right time and in actually the right place as well to see what they're doing. And they said, look, we've only studied about 147 cell types. So we would predict that, there's thousands of cell types in the human body. And so they said, as we would predict that as we study more and more cell types and we look at, more and more opportunities for things to be doing their function, that 80% is actually going to go up to 100%. And that ultimately every nucleotide we're going to find is associated with a function. Okay. So I think that there's, that was 12 years ago now, but a lot of more research has come in since then, to the point that 3 years ago, there was a paper in the journal Genome Biology and Evolution, and it said that the days of junk DNA are over. And you can find other papers that are saying things to that effect over the last few years, post ENCODE, that basically, there are still people who believe in junk DNA. Don't get me wrong, especially folks who are coming from that very committed evolutionary perspective. They're very, very wedded to the idea of junk DNA. We can come back to that later.
I want to ask you about that right now, actually.
Yeah. Well, let me finish one thing. Yeah. You asked, is the term junk DNA being used anymore? So that paper in Genome Biology, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. There's an interesting anecdote here. So Francis Collins, who of course was the head of the Human Genome Project, he has this great quote where he said in 2015, he said, I would say in terms of junk DNA, we don't use that term anymore, because I think it was pretty much a case of hubris to imagine that we could dispense with any part of the genome as if we knew enough to say it wasn't functional. There will be parts of the genome that are just, random collections of repeats like ALUs, but most of the genome that we used to think was there for spacer turns out to be doing stuff. And most of that stuff is about regulation. And that's where the epigenome gets involved. And that is teaching us a lot. Okay. So Francis Collins, very eminent geneticist, and who wrote in his 2006 book, The Language of God, that some 45% of the genome is composed of repetitive DNA that is useless. Okay. But now, this is 9 years later, post ENCODE, he's saying that we don't use that term anymore. And it was hubris to do that. Now, again, there are some scientists who still use it, but this is very interesting. It's a major shift what you're looking at there in what Colin said. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to catch you up. Go ahead.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you about that, because it seems like the entire concept is premature. And I was going to ask what was the justification for it in the first place? And Francis Collins in his perspective, his opinion is that it just came purely from hubris. But that's, now taking that and shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to ask that a lot of this seems like it's based in hubris, at least from where I'm sitting. Just looking at the model for evolutionary theory, like you'll have those images that show, the ape transitioning into a human being. And that was sort of the images that were pumped into my brain and a lot of people's other brains. My whole thing is now with these sort of logical inconsistencies popping up and being, a source for like skepticism. In my development, in my journey, like just studying this topic more, I just basically asked the question, okay, what's the hard evidence, and that's where now we get into the topic of like transitional fossils. Like if we're supposed to, if we're supposed to take this model as gospel truth, we should be seeing literal artifacts. Like the historical record should show that we have transitioned from point A to point B. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. So with junk DNA, we're talking about genetics. With fossils, we're talking about actual hard, direct evidence of organisms that have lived. And yeah, that's another major problem area for evolution. And just to close the loop on junk DNA, and we can come back to it later if you want. But I think that the junk DNA story is really a story of the evolutionary paradigm made very specific predictions that the vast majority of our genome would be junk, and those predictions turned out to be wrong. And the exact opposite happened with intelligent design. ID predicted against the tide of the consensus. The consensus was very much against what ID was saying, but ID nonetheless predicted we would find function for the junk DNA, and ID's predictions turned out to be right. So I'm not saying that this necessarily refutes evolution, but it certainly shows that evolution has made a very bad prediction. We've got to factor that in. ID made a good prediction, and we should factor that in. With transitional fossils, it's a bit more on the nose with Darwinism. I mean, Darwin had this famous quote in Origin of Species, and I could dig this up in a couple minutes here if you want. But basically, what he said was that, if my theory of gradual evolution is correct, then every stratum of geological layers should be full of intermediate stages showing the gradual progression of one type of organism evolving into another. But we don't see that. And he said, basically, this is almost a direct paraphrase, or a direct quote. He said that, this might be the gravest objection that could be urged against my theory. So Darwin himself was well aware that the fossil record was a real problem for his theory. Now, at that time, in the 1859, 1860s, and so on, the general vibe was, look, we have just started collecting fossils. Okay, we've got a long ways to go in terms of learning and discovering the fossil record. And so they were not really worried about this. They thought, years and years down the road, we will discover these predicted transitional forms. So then, like 100-something years goes by. We're now in the 1970s, 1980s. And Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge are both upstart paleontologists who are making a name for themselves. And they basically say to the paleontological community, look, we've been collecting fossils post-Darwin now for well over 100 years. Yeah, we find occasional fossils that could possibly be transitional forms. And this is what I would say, but even a broken clock is right twice a day. I mean, sometimes you might find something that you can fit into your model. But they said, by and large, these transitional forms that were predicted by Darwin have not been found. And so you get Gould, who says things like, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest, however reasonable, is not the evidence of fossils, but inference. Let's see, you have Gould saying all kinds of things like this. Here's another quote from Gould: the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates, in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. So right. Gould and Eldredge say, look, the reason we're not finding these transitional forms is because it's not like they're out there waiting for us to be discovered. They are literally not in the fossil record, okay? So their explanation at that time was something called punctuated equilibrium. We'll get to that in just a minute, but we have to just pause. The very fact that Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould had to appeal to a model like punctuated equilibrium is because, once again, the predictions of Darwin's theory of evolution were directly not found. Okay, they did not produce good scientific fruit. And so they come up with other models. We call these in science auxiliary models. Okay, if your main model fails, then maybe you can come up with some, secondary reason for why it failed. It wasn't because of the model itself, but some other thing that prevented the model from, acting as you had predicted. So their auxiliary hypothesis was a mechanism of speciation called allopatric speciation. I think that you wrote about this, Garin, in a little document you sent me. I was very impressed. You got a good knowledge of your evolutionary biology. So according to this idea, the way that new species arise is you have sort of a parent population, and maybe a segment of that population gets segregated off. Maybe a river flows through the population and cuts it off, or maybe there's an earthquake and some canyon appears, or a mountain pops up, or whatever. Somehow part of the population becomes what we would call reproductively isolated. And when that happens, in that smaller subpopulation, it may have gotten like kind of a weird little gene pool. It's kind of like the law of averages. Like if you look at baseball stats, you can sometimes have in April or May, some guy is still hitting, 400, 500, whatever, even partway through the season, because when you don't have good sample sizes, weird things can happen, right? So the hope is that maybe if you get this smaller subpopulation, maybe it just happened to lock up a weird little section of the gene pool of that species. And now that it's reproductively isolated, it can then reproduce totally in isolation from the rest of the population, and something new can get sort of fixed. New traits, new genes can get fixed into that population, and a new species evolved. And their theory said, look, this whole process could happen very, very rapidly. and this is what they're hoping at least, that this new species could arise so rapidly that there is not time in the fossil record for any of these transitional forms from the parent species to this new daughter species. There's not enough time for the transitional forms to get fossilized. Okay, so if this is the dominant mode of speciation, then this is basically a theory of evolution that predicts you will not find fossils documenting the transitional forms. So a lot of folks looked at this and they said, okay, maybe, but we're not super excited about a theory of evolution that predicts we will not find confirming fossil evidence. That's a little bit suspicious to us. I sometimes use the example of, let's say that I have a VHS tape. I don't know if you remember those.
No, I got them.
Oh, you got them. Yeah. Back in the day, a Blockbuster Video, right? So DVDs as well. But you have a VHS, and I say to you, on this VHS tape, I have leprechauns recorded. I promise you there are leprechauns on this tape, but they're too small and too fast to be seen. But I did record them, okay? You'd be like, get out of here, man. I have no time for this, right? Like, you want a theory to predict evidence, not to predict that you won't find evidence supporting it. So Punk-Eek,
If I may just interrupt, doesn't that make it a non-falsifiable theory? Is that not like kind of unscientific?
That is a criticism that's been made. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And feel free to interrupt me. I don't want to talk your ear off here. So I'm glad you did that.
My mind's running right now because you did cover a lot, but I got a few questions.
Okay. Well, let me say one more thing.
Yeah,
Another criticism of Punk-Eek is that it required too much evolution too quickly. Okay. So in To Origin of Species, Darwin has this quote where he says, look, if you want to have my theory work, you need lots of opportunities for that variation to appear. So you need very large populations and long periods of time where, just by chance, mutations can occur and you can get that variation that might be needed to help the population survive and reproduce, which allows evolution to proceed forward. Okay. So Darwin's theory, sort of one of its glories, was large populations, long periods of time. Well, Punk-Eek then robs Darwin's mechanism of those glories because it compresses the vast majority of evolution into very small populations in very short periods of time. And so a lot of folks have felt like, genetically speaking, requires too much change too quickly, and it's not going to work for making evolution happen.
Right. So basically, doesn't punctuate equilibrium? Doesn't it make the job just like harder? Because you're shortening the time span in which things can happen, and according to Darwin, you need that time. We're throwing out the entire phyletic gradualism model in favor for a model that basically says, the change happens abruptly all at once, and therefore I don't know, like isn't it kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack? Like, you make the search. I guess they don't want to make the search for any fossil evidence, but if you were to, it would make the job just that much harder.
I mean, they definitely have wanted to find fossil evidence, and there's a lot of people who still look for fossils today. And there are some folks that would say we have found transitional forms. I think most of the examples that I'm aware of tend to evaporate on closer inspection. But that being said, you're right. This is not a good model for evolution, that you have to have it happen so rapidly. This is not the way they wanted their theory to end up.
So, which school of thought do you think is like winning out these days? Because it seems like there's an inherent contradiction there, that the phyletic gradualism school of thought versus the Punk-Eek thought. Stephen Jay Gould, they came up with that school of thought because they themselves saw that there was an issue with as he said, you said it in your quote that there was they were going off inference.
Yeah.
It's the same issue that I brought up that Ludwig von Mises was talking about. Point A to point B, but everything in between is up for interpretation. So they themselves saw that issue and they came up with an entirely new theory, really. But they still, I think I bring that up because I think there's, that people like your average person who thinks of evolution does not realize that there's these contradictions within the field itself. So yeah, I don't know. Who do you think is winning?
Yeah. That's a great question. When I was in college, both Richard Dawkins and Stephen Jay Gould spoke at my alma mater, UC San Diego. Dawkins was a famous, or he's still around, of course. Dawkins is a famous proponent of the gradual version of evolution, phyletic gradualism, as you said. And Gould, of course, was a model of the punctual equilibrium model. And so I asked Stephen Jay Gould, so what do you think of Dawkins' ideas? And he said, well, Dawkins just doesn't understand my theories. So that's what he told me. But I mean, long story short, though, is you're right. You're 100% right, Garn, that there's not full agreement within the scientific community about how evolution happens. Some people say, oh, it's got to happen very gradually, one little mutation at a time. And then there's other people who say, well, it happens very rapidly. They might also say one little mutation at a time, but they would say that actually evolution can happen very quickly. And then you get folks who will say sometimes you can get mutations that have large effects. And this has come about really in the last, I would say, 20 or so years with this field called evo-devo. The idea that very particular types of mutations that affect the early developmental processes of organisms, that those mutations, one mutation can have very large downstream effects on how an organism develops. And so evo-devo is kind of like it's kind of like that Hail Mary pass. You hope that you can get these miracle mutations that radically change a body plan of an organism to make something totally new. You might be able to A, explain how evolution happens, and B, explain how it happens very rapidly, all in one fell swoop. The problem is that, the experimental data shows that when you mutate genes that are involved with the very early developmental processes of organisms, that kills the organism. It doesn't make something new. It really messes up these developmental programs, and then the organism just it dies basically. It doesn't make it. So it's also not a very good model. But yeah, these are a lot of unresolved questions in evolution today.
So from what you're saying about, I didn't even know about that evo-devo. And it seems like that just sort of reinforces in my mind that the evolutionists are like they're just trying to sort of grasp at straws. They're trying to sort of justify a theory that doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't really hold water when you scrutinize a little bit. And so, I'm sort of curious, and I'm wondering, like, what does the evidence say to you about the origin of life? Like, where do you stand on all of that?
Yeah. So for me, I would take a position of intelligent design. I think that when we look at a question like the origin of life, it's really a question of the origin of the information in living organisms, because life fundamentally works based upon information in living organisms. My colleague, Dr. Brian Miller, has talked about how living organisms are very strange physical arrangements of matter in our universe. Okay, they have very low entropy, meaning that they're very ordered. Okay, there's not very much disorder within them. Yet at the same time, they're very high energy. Okay, it's very easy in nature to find things that are high entropy and high energy. Think of a tornado. Think of an undersea thermal vent. You get lots of swirling and energetic processes going on, but there's not much order. Mm-hmm. Or you can find things that are low entropy and also low energy. Think of a crystal, an ice crystal or any geological crystal. They're very highly ordered, but they're states of very, very low energy. To find a system that has both very high order and high energy, we don't see that anywhere else other than life. And how does life maintain that state of being low entropy or high order, but also high energy? Well, it does it by using machinery, literally molecular machines in your cells that are capable of taking all that energy and harnessing it to perform some useful function. We do this all the time. We take the explosions of gasoline that in our car engine that would otherwise, cause all kinds of chaos, and we fine tune that so that you can turn pistons and convert that into a mechanical motion so that your wheels will spin, you can move forward. Okay. We are very familiar, whether we realize it or not, from the human realm with the principle that machines are the way that you harness energy and create high order, high energy systems. So it's actually not just life, but also human technology that has this high order, high energy principle. And the way that you do that is through machines. So our cells are full of these molecular machines. Well, where do these molecular machines come from? Well, they are encoded through information in your DNA. In your DNA, you have information that encodes all these protein parts of these molecular machines in your cells, which then assemble together to perform all kinds of crucial biological functions. So what you're looking at is information. And the same is true for machines, right? Machines don't just come out of nowhere. Machines require a blueprint. Machines require careful assembly instructions. You have to take matter and arrange them. All kinds of information goes into the building of a machine, which then can basically use energy to do work and create those high energy, highly ordered systems, et cetera, et cetera. So the essence of life is information, which then builds machines, all right? And information processing. You can't just have that information in your DNA. You've got to be able to use it. If we can, going back to our VHS analogy, now we can, move forward to the age of the DVD, right? So we still use DVDs occasionally, but if you think of a DVD by itself is not going to do anything for you. Okay, you could use it as a Frisbee or a coffee coaster. You need a machine in order to read the information on that DVD and then watch the movie or do whatever it is. Okay, so that's just how our DNA is. All right, DNA by itself, the information is not self-extracting. You have you have machinery in your cells that can read the information on your DNA and then convert it to some kind of a useful output. This is the transcription and translation of DNA to RNA to protein that we talked about earlier. And that's all that basic information processing, building proteins in the cell, all that is done with machines, okay? So you need machines to be able to read that information. Now, of course, one of the big conundrums with a DVD player, imagine that the instructions for building the very first DVD player were on a DVD. Right, you'd be kind of screwed, right? Because you wouldn't know how to build a DVD without the DVD player, right. But you need the DVD player to read the DVD, et cetera, go in circles forever. That's kind of how DNA is. DNA contains the instructions for building the machinery that is used for reading the information off of the DNA and using it, okay? So you can't just have the information or the machines. You got to have the whole system from scratch or it doesn't work, okay? And this is literally a system like computer-like information processing. Bill Gates has famously says this quote, and it's something to the effect of human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than anything we've ever created. Okay. So this is very interesting that whatever you think of Bill Gates, he's a computer expert and a brilliant guy, and he sees the similarity between software and DNA. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it's not from nowhere that he says that, because our DNA literally contains commands and codes, which can then be read and interpreted to, by the cellular machinery to build all these molecular machines and control what's going on in your cell. Okay. So then, of course, what is the product of this information processing? It's machines. So where in our experience, this is sort of the basic, very, very basic case for intelligent design and the origin of life. Where in our experience do things like, commands and codes, language-based codes, information, where do these things come from? Where does computer-like information processing, where does that come from? Where do machine-like structures, where do they come from? In all of our experience, these kinds of things have only one cause, and that is intelligence, okay? So intelligent design is not just a theory that's sitting around critiquing evolution, saying, oh, well, you can't build this, or you don't have the fossils, or you predicted junk DNA wrongly, etc. We will say that, sure. But there's also very much a positive argument for intelligent design that's based upon finding in nature the kind of information and complexity which in our experience only comes from intelligence. So we're talking about language-based code and information. We're talking about information processing, the ability to read commands and codes and convert them to some kind of output. And then we're talking about machines. In all of our experience, these things only come from intelligence. So
if I may,
yeah,
this is why I think people like your average person will stay married to the idea of evolution, because a conversation like this, when we're speaking about information processing, and the intelligent design, it implies there's a religious implications. It implies that there is a creator, I would say, because it implies that, like like man creating technology, the technology doesn't have the instructions for itself or the machine to read the information for itself, to replicate itself. The man needs to design and then create. So it's sort of like a chicken and the egg sort of situation. Like how did life come to be? It couldn't have created itself. And the evolution model is, I guess, it goes back to the Big Bang. Everything started within this primordial soup, and particles smashed into each other, and somehow created this, like, the semblance of entities, which created other entities. And so, I mean, to me, intelligent design is what makes sense. But I'm just saying that I think the reason why there's a sentiment that evolution is what people stay married to is because they're afraid of the religious implications. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I think for some people, I'm sure that is probably true. I mean, so before we get into the implications, let me just make one quick point. The argument that I just made for intelligent design, I didn't invoke God or the Bible
No, I know
or
you don't.
faith or the Quran. No, I know, I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm just, I made an argument based upon science and our experience that information comes from intelligence. Okay, we could drill down a lot more, detail what that means and how I use information, et cetera. But I'm only making an argument based upon the scientific method here. So if somebody is going to reject ID, you can't say my argument is based upon religion or faith or divine revelation, but it's based upon science. Nonetheless, a scientific theory can have religious implications.
Mhm.
I mean, look at Darwinism. Many people have said that, Richard Dawkins, who keep talking about Dawkins, he said that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. All right. Now, I'm not saying you can't believe in God and evolution. I think many people do, but the bottom line is that evolution, according to many people, you can't deny. They see anti-religious implications coming from evolution. I think that intelligent design certainly does have religion-friendly implications because it implies that there is a designer and a creator, behind many aspects of life in the universe. We can actually through scientific methods, we can see that an intelligent cause is required, and that has implications. So some folks don't like that. I mean, all I can say is it is what it is. I think it was Plato or Socrates said that we should follow the evidence where it leads. And, that's true for all of us, for me, if it's leading away from my own preferences, I've got to be willing to acknowledge that as well. But I think that, we need to keep an open mind about these things. But no doubt what you said, Garn, is right. That for some people, the implication of a designer who, sounds a lot like God is going to scare them. I personally am a Christian. I believe in God. I don't try to hide that. I believe that the designer is the God of the Bible. Now, for me, that's a conclusion that goes beyond the theory of intelligent design. I have colleagues in the ID community who come from different religious backgrounds. We have folks who are Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, agnostic, and we all believe and agree that there is empirical evidence for design in nature. And sort of the question of the identity of the designer is sort of a farther down the road question that you don't have to answer that just to be able to say, look, there's evidence for design. But for me, yeah, I mean, I don't try to hide my religious beliefs. I don't think anybody in the ID community does, but there's no doubt there are implications for intelligent design, and some people are not going to like that. Yeah.
Why do you think that that this orthodoxy of evolution is still like so pervasive within our culture and within the academic fields, like despite all these sorts of inconsistencies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of this gets into the sociology of science, and we could take the easy way out and say, oh, well, all the elites of the world, whether they're in academia or the courts or the media, they're all trending in a very, sort of atheistic direction in their worldviews. So they just want evolution to be true. I'm sure that there is some element of truth to that, but that's not the whole story. There's a lot more. We're very complicated creatures, and there's many people who are in the academic elites who believe in God and yet are firmly committed to Darwin. I mean, Francis Collins, who we quoted earlier, he may have rejected the idea of junk DNA, but he's a very firmly committed evolutionist. And he actually helped, one of the leaders of the theistic evolutionist movement that, says that God used basically evolutionary mechanisms to create everything. So I think what it comes down to is, we can talk about Thomas Kuhn, the famous historian of science who wrote that book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in the 70s. And basically what he said is that in scientific fields, they are typically governed by a paradigm. And the paradigm sort of sets the tone for what people in a field are going to believe, how they interpret the data, how they, fit research projects together and tell a greater story. And it's very, very difficult to dislodge a paradigm, okay? It takes a long time. Basically, a number of things have to happen. Number one, there have to be a lot of problems with the leading paradigm. And I think that we're definitely there with evolution, but not everyone wants to see it. One of the problems we have today, and this gets talked about a lot among critics of modern academia, is that people are compartmentalized, okay? You only see your little subfield that you're an expert in. You don't see the big picture. Very few, it takes a scientist at a very particular grand stage of their career to see the big picture and to put it all together. And so, the geneticists might realize, okay, we're having trouble explaining these molecular machines, but the paleontologists, they've got the fossils, all right? They know, we know evolution is true because they've got the fossils. And then the paleontologists, they know we don't have the fossils, but they talk to the geneticists. Oh, the geneticists have shown common ancestry is true because of sequence similarity. And then you talk to the systematists who study genetics and how you construct trees of life, and they know that the tree of life has had a lot of problems because one gene gives you one version of the tree of life and another gene gives you a different version of the tree of life. There's all these inconsistencies when they try to use genetics to construct these grand phylogenetic trees of life. But they think that the microbiologists and the biochemists and the paleontologists have it figured out. So everybody thinks somebody else has it figured out. But when you look at the big picture, there's pretty much problems everywhere you look with the evolutionary model. But you have to be willing to see it from that bigger picture perspective. Meanwhile, the paradigm is there. To go against the paradigm, according to Thomas Kuhn, is kind of like committing career suicide, right? Like you are suddenly going to be persona non grata. I think that even in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn says that scientists are typically intolerant of scientists that are proposing minority views, sort of new paradigms. But nonetheless, it happens. So this is exactly what's going on with intelligent design.
Isn't it kind of ironic? Because doesn't that go against like the spirit of science, which is that, when there's a new idea or a contradictory idea, but if it happens to be right, if all the evidence holds up, then it should wipe out the old idea. But it seems to be like there's politics is ingrained within academia and science, that they sort of hold on to the ideas that make their careers, and is that what it is, that they sort of push out or like just scrub out like opposing views that and don't allow people to get published in journals and stuff? Is that what it is?
I mean, it doesn't happen universally, and there are examples where scientific revolutions have happened, and what was once plate tectonics in the early 1900s was ridiculed. Okay, but then in the 1970s, suddenly people put together the pieces. They had collected all this sea topographic data from all these, new technologies that were being developed, undersea radar, submarines that were going around during some of the world wars, World War II and after, mapping the seafloor, and they realized, oh my gosh, plate tectonics is true. And there was a very rapid paradigm shift in the 1970s. But before that, what you're saying is exactly right. People were laughed out of town for proposing that the continents moved. But then when a new paradigm was put together and it made much better sense of the data, people were like, oh my, this is actually the right answer. So you would like to think that in the long term, truth wins out in the scientific community. I'm a fairly optimistic person. I would like to think that happens. But I've also had my bubble burst enough times to realize that a lot of times people are not perfectly objective robots. So if you're coming at this interview thinking that scientists are perfectly objective robots who always just follow the evidence where it leads, I'm sorry, but you are in for a big surprise. Scientists are human beings. Look, I have a PhD in geology. I spent many years doing research in the scientific community. Scientists are great people, okay? They're not all mad scientists trying to destroy the world. They're people who love nature. They're quirky. They're fascinated by how nature works, and they love figuring it out. I think that's really cool, but they're also people, okay? And so there's all kinds of politics going on in science. You talk to 1,000 scientists, you will get 1,000 different stories of politics interfering with what should have happened at some point in their career. I've seen it happen totally outside of intelligent design. And I had a great experience doing research in the scientific community. So it happens. It's real. We just have to accept it. Okay. The hope is that nonetheless, we just keep promoting the views that we think are true and keep trying to produce data and doing good science that we think represents the best science that's out there. And over time, you hope that the truth will win out, even if it takes generations. That's the last part. Okay. So we've got, obviously, some people might not like the implications of intelligent design, or they're committed to evolution for sort of ideological reasons. There's the paradigm problem, but then there's just the problem that people are very slow to change their minds. Okay. And so somebody who's committed their whole career to a paradigm or to a particular view, they're not going to easily just give up on that. They've published all these papers. They've invested time, money, years of their life to a particular idea. It's that's again, a very human quality. Mm-hmm. We're not quick to give up on ideas that we've committed our lives to. That's true for everybody. Okay. And so what that means is that a lot of times the people who are quickest to adopt a new paradigm are the young up and coming scientists, the ones who are more open-minded, that have not already sort of channelized themselves down a particular, route of their career path. And so there's a couple people out there who have said this famous quote that, scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time. I don't mean that in a dark or violent, malicious sense in any way, shape, or form. What it just is saying is that scientific revolutions happen when the old guard kind of naturally just, go the way of the dinosaur, and the new up and coming guard, generation, they have open minds. They can see things that the old guard just had blind spots. And then you get these paradigm shifts. And, I think, we're not it's not happening tomorrow with intelligent design, but we have a very large body of young graduate students in our ID community who see the evidence for design and on their own are committed to it. So I'm very hopeful that ID has a good future ahead of it.
Yeah. I mean, tell me about, I'll ask you this one last question, and I'll let you go. But how do you see the future playing out sort of with intelligent design, pitting it against the orthodoxy of evolution? You're talking about the young graduates taking up the mantle. But how is that going to play out, not just in academia, but, to the point where it gets instituted within the education curriculum? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that in the last few years, and actually we've seen this for quite a few years, but we're seeing it more and more. Mainstream scientists are willing to be critical of Darwinian evolution. Mm-hmm. Okay. So there was, for example, a conference at the Royal Society of London in 2016, where we saw some very credible mainstream scientists who were critiquing the neo-Darwinian paradigm. Now, granted, they had their own models of evolution, like Evo, Devo, or others, but the bottom line is that they were very, very critical of the mainstream model of evolution and the dominant model, and they were willing to say that. Earlier this year, there's an Oxford University evolutionary biologist named Dennis Noble. He said, the fact is that I think neo-Darwinism is dead. Earlier this year, also a University of Chicago biologist named James Shapiro, he said that intelligent design has a valid point with regards to the limits, the explanatory limits of neo-Darwinism. Okay, so he's not an ID proponent, but he thinks that the ID arguments, our criticisms of the neo-Darwinian model, are legitimate. Now, what do all of these scientists have in common? They are all at the tail end of their careers. Okay, they've all had very eminent careers. They are very well respected in the scientific community. They've kind of got nothing left to lose. They've already made their mark. So now they feel comfortable coming out and saying, yeah, this main model of evolution, the neo-Darwinian model, it's got serious problems. And we've got to come up with better explanations, better arguments, et cetera, et cetera. So where we're kind of at right now today in the scientific community is I think that we are entering a post-Darwinian world, okay? And this has been going on for at least a decade or two. People are looking at post-Darwinian models of evolution, where the dominant model of evolution is not just random mutation, natural selection, but other mechanisms as well, which are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, like explaining where new complex biological structures and features and types of organisms come from, okay? A lot of the main heavy lifting of evolutionary theory, where does novelty come from, can't be done by neo-Darwinism. It's got to be done by something else. So right now, these post-Darwinian models are entering their heyday. There's a lot of talk about the extended evolutionary synthesis, epigenetic change. How does that work? Et cetera, neo-Lamarckism. And I think it's really interesting. And some of these ideas hold promise for explaining some things, maybe not all things. I think that, for example, epigenetics, neo-Lamarckism can explain how organisms can sort of modulate traits within limits in response to changing environmental conditions. It's sort of like, how do organisms rapidly adapt to a changing environment? Well, they're actually pre-programmed, we might even say designed, to be able to do that. But they're not designed to be able to mutate indefinitely and evolve into some fundamentally new type of organism. Okay, so we're talking about pre-programmed adaptability within limits, not the classical view of unlimited evolution, which ultimately any evolutionary model has to explain. You know, how do you get from a molecule to a rabbit, et cetera, et cetera. So where we're at right now is we're entering this post-Darwinian phase. Now, I think that intelligent design is one of the competitors for what model is going to replace neo-Darwinism. But I also think that most of the scientific community is not ready for that yet. But they're recognizing, there's a number of folks that have recognized that we're making good arguments. Okay, so I think that they're paying attention to us, even if they don't always admit it. I mean, James Shapiro is pretty bold and pretty courageous. I actually give him kudos for being willing to say that ID makes some good challenges to neo-Darwinism, even though he is very clear he's not an ID proponent. So I respect that a lot, but I think that a lot of folks see that and they're just not willing to acknowledge it. Let me give you one last anecdote here. In 2014, so about 10 years ago, I said this is conversations been going on for a while. There were two papers in the journal Nature that basically were arguing for and against whether the standard neo-Darwinian model needs a rethink. All right. So one of the articles argued that, yes, it's working fine. We don't need to replace the neo-Darwinian model. You can certainly find folks in the scientific community who hold that view. But this other paper said, no, we need a fundamentally new model of evolution, needs a rethink. And they said that there are actually a lot of scientists out there that are critical of neo-Darwinism. But this article said that people are fearful of critiquing neo-Darwinism for fear of being accused of lending credence to intelligent design.
Wow.
So we are kind of living rent-free in the heads of a lot of mainstream evolutionists because they know that we're making good arguments, but they're afraid of saying anything that might look like we are, they have any sympathies towards us.
They're afraid.
So, but look, I mean, I'm okay with being in this position because all I care about is the truth. The thing I care about the most, more than anything, is the truth. Okay. And what does the evidence say? And I think that the evidence is on our side. I think that young up and coming scientists see this, which is why we have many young scientists that are joining our community. And we also have, current established scientists who contact us on a weekly basis. And our community is growing at a very, very regular, but, impressively hopeful rate of new scientists joining our ID research community and getting involved. And so there's a lot of, I think sympathy for ID out there, even if, good things to come. So, as the scientific revolution progresses, run one funeral at a time, I'm hopeful that, it'll shift more and more in the direction of ID. So it might be a few years, maybe when I say a few years, I mean like decades, before intelligent design is really, really taken seriously as the right replacement for neo-Darwinism. But I think we're moving in that direction.
No, I didn't even realize it was that hopeful. I was kind of hopeless about the situation, but from what you're telling me, there's actually, something to be excited about. When I was writing my pieces, I thought I was just, speaking into the void. But honestly, I'm very happy to have you on, Casey. I think also this conversation, having it out there, it's gonna sort of hopefully push it, towards a better direction as well. So yeah, I'm happy to have you on whenever you want as well. I think we can keep having more conversations.
It's been fun, Gar, and I don't get to do a lot of long interviews like this, and I appreciate the slower pace. We can have a conversation, and you're a great conversation partner on this. I appreciate it.
All right, yeah, I'll hit you up again at some point in the future. Thanks for coming on.
Sounds good. Thank you.